Welcome to the Oak Ridge Institute for Continued Learning, ORICL Class number 312, Yet Even More Stories from the Secret City. I'm Ray Smith, and I have a guest with me today that I'll introduce in just a moment. The next 3 Mondays, today, the 16th and the 23rd, we'll be having our class here, and I'm glad to have all of you with me, and I hope you'll come back for the other 2 sessions and encourage others to come. I am recording it, and we'll put it up on YouTube when we finish. My guest this morning is Carter Hydrick. Oh, here comes another person. And then I have a guest lined up for the 16th that'll talk about her experience with nuclear weapons. And then I'm still working on the one for the 23rd. I'm hoping to get Emily Strasser here, who's written the book, The Half-Life of a Secret, but she hadn't responded yet. So we'll see how that turns out. Again, I want Carter to be with us today. And then remember, at the end, if we have any time at all, I'll ask for any ideas you have for our next class. And then we'll include those as we go along. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I don't know, Carter, if you have anything you want to show, you can share your screen if you like. So it'll work.
Well, I tried real hard to have something. As you know, when I used to present this, I used to do it with on an overhead projector because I felt like it was closer to the reality. The documents actually were closer to reality when I just showed a copy of them. Yeah. But you can't do that here. So I thought, at one point in the past, I was invited by the Houston Museum of Natural Science to present there to their monthly thing, and so I put it all on a Sun drive, did a whole presentation all the way through. But it lost all the documents. It's got my headers and stuff, but all the documents got lost out there. And I thought, well, where else do I have it? And I thought, I don't know if you remember this, but you guys were not backwards. You guys, when I presented it the second time in the classified area there that you got me into, you guys recorded it from that. So I thought, well, I'll get it off of this. Problem is, it's a CD, and I don't have anything to run a CD. I do have this. We'll run a CD. I found it, but I couldn't find the patch cord that'll get it to my computer. So I got that close. I was going through this ganglion knot of cables trying to find the patch cord. I couldn't find it. So I got that close. I'm sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. You can describe it for us. Now, okay. Let me do one thing here before you get started. Let's see if I can cause it to bring me back up. And I'm not getting it. I don't know why. It insists on you being the speaker. Maybe you can see this, folks, well enough. That's his book, Critical Mass. And Carter, you'll notice that it's the latest edition.
Thank you, Ray. I was wondering who bought it this month, who that was.
That's his book. It's available on Amazon. And let's just start. Let me go back to multiple speaker now. I've got something coming up here that it's hiding my view. Now I got it. All right. I think this will bring you up, Carter. Let's go back all the way to the very beginning of your interest in that caused you to write this book, and just tell us how it all came about.
So I started out in the film and video business. I worked this many years ago when I was a young man. I worked for a year in Hollywood, worked on a couple of feature films, worked for a year on a TV show. And that was where my heart really lay, was in doing that kind of work. I had a producer call me one day and said, "You like history, right?" I said, "Yeah, I love history." World War II? I said, "Yeah, I love World War II." He says, "I got a guy you need to meet." So we set up a meeting, and I went to this gentleman's house. His name was Arthur Nyax, and he was a German. A German, had served in the German army during World War II, and actually had served at Stalingrad. And he was in the siege there. He was. I don't know if people. Stalingrad is generally considered to Germany lost all their soldiers, which they did, except for 2,007 of them. The SS there was a double enwrapment there, double anyway, a double siege. They had kind of two loops around them, around the Germans, and Ray was in the outside one. And they said they had another division, but a pretty good sized deployment of SS troops, and they were able to break through part of the line for the first one, and they got Ray in 2006 other German soldiers out of there. Not Ray, you're Ray. They got Art and and yeah, I'm getting old, Anyway, they got Art out of there, and he had lived a fascinating life. After that, I could write a book about him himself. We sat and talked, and he shared his story. And he was 72, I think, at the time, and he told us that his kids had been through such an interesting life, and his kids had said, "Dad, you need to write this all down. You need to," and he had avoided it, and then he finally decided, okay, he was going to do it. And as part of doing it, he always had stuck in his craw that the main Nazis at the end of the war, while they were sending out, he had frostbite and had been wounded in Stalingrad, and they took him back to Berlin, and he was healing up for 18 months. And then when the Russians seized Berlin, they ordered him to go out walking wounded and go out and fight with the teenagers and try and save Berlin. And he just went through all kinds of hell, frankly. And in the meantime, they're sending walking wounded and teenagers out to fight the Russians, and the higher ups are taking all the loot they can get and getting out of town. And that always irked him. And so as part of, and also I think he didn't say this specifically. I maybe put something in his mouth, but I don't think so. I think it's how he really felt. I think he wanted to explain, he wanted to understand and explain why he thought he was doing the right thing at one time for fighting, and then why it went south. Anyway, in his studies, he found, I think it was 3 little documents that basically said, in his mind, said that the Germans had created an atomic bomb, and it was surrendered to or captured by the United States. And I was like, and he showed me the documents, and one of them was a right compelling document. It's one of the first ones, if you'll recall, and probably the most powerful one from the presentation, that shows that the Germans surrendered 560 kilograms. My memory doesn't keep numbers very well, but I believe it's 560 kilograms of uranium on this U-boat. And this particular document said that the uranium was stowed in gold-lined cylinders, and that it was there was another document that he didn't find, that I found later, that said that they were broken into 80 smaller cylinders, and that when they were opened, they would become sensitive and dangerous. And I thought, that to me, that was a serious document, and I was looking at it, I thought, no, there's something interesting here, because I'm not a scientist by any stretch, but I lived in Utah for several years, and I knew people that worked in uranium mines there, and I knew that natural uranium didn't require that kind of caution, especially not back then. The other document he had was a document saying that two men and a woman flew out of Berlin off of the runway, the makeshift runway they had there, in the last days, and one of them was Martin Bormann. And he said from those, there was one other kind of a secondary document. There's a third one that was there, and I don't remember what it was, but I remember those two documents. Well, this is really interesting. And I told him, I said, this is you're talking about the Manhattan Project, which is, in terms of history, is at that time there's still a lot of people who worked on Manhattan Project who are still alive. We're talking about 1983, I think this was when I first got in it. And I said, it's a relatively new history, and by virtue of its technical nature, it's probably the most documented piece of history in the world. I don't think, but where there's smoke, you got to check and see what's causing the smoke. And those two documents made me think there's something going on, but I didn't think at all it was going to turn out to what it was going to be. So I told him, you want to make a movie out of this, but you're right, I'm serious about history, and you can't make a movie out of this before making a book that is fully documented, critically reviewed, and put in place where it ought or ought not to be. Frankly, if it doesn't hold up, then it doesn't hold up, get shot down. But it needs to be a book first, where everything can be properly documented, annotated, and put up for critical review. And that's how I got started.
Oh, good.
Excuse me.
That's good. And back that was in the 80s when you started, and then probably in the 90s, if I remember correctly. I learned about it after you had published it. I don't remember when it was first published.
The first one was, I don't remember either, frankly. The first one was published
98. First copyrights in 98. Okay. So
okay.
maybe around 2000 or early 2000s.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and I actually, you came to Oak Ridge, and we literally went out to Y12 and took you into Beta 3, where the Calutron still exists today. And then we had time to let you make a presentation to some folks there at Y12, and we had you speak out in the city too. You spent some time with us here in Oak Ridge, and I got interested in the book at that point. And you and I have stayed in touch over the years, and it's exciting to me that what you have turned up here. There's also been others working on it as well, and there's some information available for folks if they're interested in looking at it on the History Channel. If you look for anything about a submarine called a U-boat, U-234, that's your key to find out the same information that Carter has published in Critical Mass that's out there. But now let's go back and dig a little more details into what you found and what just continue your thoughts about how you brought the book into being.
Okay, so from there, I told Rob, we need to make it a book and art, and they said, well, how long will that take? And I said, well, it'll probably take about a year to research. And if the research pulls out, then we'll make a book, and if it doesn't, we'll still make a movie just for fun. It took 10 years. Rob pulled out after the first year and a half. I kept going, paying for it on my own. A lot of time, a lot of money, tens of thousands of dollars. I making good money at the time, and I dug up, started digging went to the archives, the National Archives in Washington 5 times, and twice to the Southeast Archives in East Point, Georgia. That's where they were at the time, and came up with all kinds of stuff. And Art's account wasn't exactly right, but it was close enough that it's a compelling piece of history, not just an addition, or not just a footnote, but an actual important addition to the history, because it changed this part of the history that is unknown, changed the world. Now, as you said, a lot of people have done research on this, and it started out. I described that first document about the gold line cylinders. I have more time than we did on the podcast, right? So we can take a little more.
Yeah, we've got a full hour here, so take your time.
All right. So I had that document. I've presented, to symposia and museums and kind of stuff, universities all over the U.S. Well, western part of the U.S., nothing on the east, except at Oak Ridge. And somebody said, well, I don't believe that document. I believe you created it. And I'm like, there's a lady named Vilma Hunt who wrote, resourced this document in her own articles that she wrote about U-234 when I was a teenager, long before I ever heard about any of this stuff, So it's been around a long time. But other people, Joseph Scalia, you may know him. He did a book about U-234. Other people have found the documentation. They've been historians and journalists, and they haven't understood what they were looking at. And frankly, I didn't either, other than, like I said, I knew some people that had worked with uranium, and I knew that some of what I was seeing in that one document didn't sound like natural uranium. So I went looking into the archives, and I found all kinds of documentation, both on the Navy side about when U-234 was captured. There was 3 or 4 transmissions, and there kind of a whole discussion about U-234. It said U-234. Let me see if I can find it in the book here.
Now, while he's looking, let me remind you that we're talking about uranium, U-235 being the isotope that we're talking about, but the U-boat is named U-234. So don't get confused when we use those terms. One's the name of the U-boat, the other is the material that we're talking about that was on the submarine, which is known as a U-boat.
And I've always considered that and I've had people ask me about it because it's kind of a spooky little coincidence, right? That they're both, given the same alphabetical number and numerical numbers that are one apart from each other, and it's just kind of weird.
It's just a coincidence.
Yeah. It says here, and so in the book, I begin each of the chapters of the book with a little can't forget what they call it, but a little blurb from the actual documentation relating to the book or firsthand witnesses. And this one transmission, it's the U.S. Navy secret transmission 222115 from the Commander-in-Chief of the Naval Operations. From the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy to the Commander of Naval Operations at Portsmouth Naval Yard, which is where U-234 was taken. It says, the desire of following accomplished cargo U-234, an inventory list sent to CNO, Commander Naval Operations, who will give shipping instructions and will control access to the disposition of all cargo due to importance to the Pacific War. And then there's some other ones where they're kind of arguing over what to do with, not arguing with it, but the press is saying, here's another one, and this is press representatives. This is a command also sent from the Commander Naval Operations to Portsmouth on disposition of how to handle the prisoners in general that were captured and brought to Portsmouth. It says press representatives may be permitted to interview officers and men of German submarines that surrender. This message applies only to submarines that surrender. It does not apply to other prisoners of war. It does not apply to prisoners of U-234. So out of all the submarines, they're saying U-234 is off hands. You can't touch these guys. You can't talk to them. Prisoners of U-234, I'm quoting again, prisoners of U-234 must not be interviewed by press representatives. Okay.
All right. Now, Carter, let me insert one other thing here, just to lay the background for what we're talking about. U-234 was a submarine leaving Germany going to Japan. All right, that was the intent. Now it says the ultimate secret, I'm reading from Carter's book now, said the ultimate secret of U-234 still lay quietly in its sleeping hull. For jam-packed throughout the monstrous boat was the elite of Nazi Germany's newest weapons development, including a completely disassembled Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, the first jet aircraft to be used in combat, and the plans and material to build Germany's ultra-secret V4 rocket, the long-distance version of the feared V2, as well as a mysterious stratosphere plane, apparently an aircraft that could reach and cruise in the rarefied atmosphere of near space. But most important, buried in the nose of the mammoth boat, sealed in cylinders lined with gold, was 560 kilograms, 1,120 pounds of uranium oxide labeled U-235, the fissile material from which atom bombs are made. Now that kind of sets the background for what Carter's researching here. That's what was in this U-234. It was intended to go to Japan, but at the end of the war with Germany, all of the submarines were sent a message, the German submarines, and were told to surrender to the nearest Allied force. Now, this particular captain decided he would surrender to the United States. And that's how U-234 came to Virginia. And that kind of lays the background for what Carter's telling you here. Carter, excuse me for interrupting you, but I thought it would be good for people to have that background. Now you go ahead.
I'm sorry, got you back just when he said you go ahead. So I'm not sure what you said in the last 5 or 10 seconds.
All I said was that I gave them that background just to kind of help them set the perspective of what you're talking about. So go ahead with your story.
I appreciate that. And actually, the Portsmouth is actually in New Hampshire. It's not in Virginia. So it did end up in Virginia. They did bring it down to actually, is it Maryland? Where's anyway, it ended up at the naval yards down in Washington D.C. area where they do all the ordnance work and everything. So might have been in Virginia, might have been in Maryland. I don't know. Another dispatch. It says after that first one, I just said nobody's supposed to talk to prisoners. No press is supposed to talk to prisoners U-234. Then there's another one follows on that, says maintain prisoners U-234 incommunicado and send them under Navy Department representative to Washington for interrogation. So they actually, and there's films of this, the journalists were allowed to film, and they actually did take some pictures, and we're after about 3 days of arguing between the military and the journalists, the Navy did let them ask some basic questions of the captain. And there was a whole retinue. There was a German general, Ruler Kessler, who was being sent to Tokyo as the liaison between Germany and Japan on this whole thing. There's a scientist named Heinz Schlicke. I remember his name today, Ray. Named Heinz Schlicke, who was responsible for the science he'd been versed in. There was 52 different types of science and technology on it. He'd been versed in all of that. He was the liaison for the scientific side of that with Japan. And there were other 2 civilian engineers that had to do with the rocketry. There was all kinds of. Ray already read the list of what was on the boat, but there was all these passengers. There's 12 passengers, not necessarily civilian. 2 of them were civilian. There were 2 Japanese. Anyway, they're all on this boat.
And who was the high-ranking German officer that was there?
That was General Ulrich Kessler. He had been in command of the German Luftwaffe over Norway during the initial battles with Norway and Britain. Pretty well wiped out Britain at that time, right? That was even before Dunkirk. And so they had put him in charge as the liaison with Tokyo. There was a colonel. There was
right. While we're talking about the passengers on the boat, talk about the 2 Japanese Army officers.
So there was a couple of Japanese officers, a Colonel Tomonaga and I think he was also Colonel Soji. I've seen it spelled 3 different ways. I go with Soji with the J. I've seen it SH, and anyway, they were on the U-boat, and when the U-boat, the chief radio operator of the U-boat was a gentleman by the name of Wolfgang Hirschfeld, and he was there when they were packing the U-boat, when they were loading the U-boat, and he described. Actually, I'll see if I can find it. I could probably read it straight from his description. He described, yeah, it's right here. I'll just read it to you.
Okay.
So he's watching them unload the U-boat or load the U-boat in Kiel, Germany.
All
So
right.
it's the most important and secret item of cargo, the uranium oxide, which I believe was radioactive, was loaded into one of the vertical steel tubes of German and then I put in parentheses so to give context of German U-boat U-234. Two Japanese officers were painting a description in black characters on the brown paper wrapping. Once the inscription U-235 had been painted on the wrapping of a package, it would then be carried over and stowed in one of the 6 vertical mine shafts. And he goes on to describe how these, he called them crates, but they're 9 inches square cubes. Now that doesn't sound like a crate. To me, you usually think of a crate as something bigger, but he described how they carried them. He said they had put eye bolts on either side of these crates, and they had put steel poles through them, and it took 2 men to pick up these 9-inch boxes, one on each end. And their knees were buckling as they were carrying them, and he couldn't imagine what in the world. And that time, uranium was kind of unknown of by the average man, and he was the average man in this case. He didn't know anything about uranium. He found out later. When he found out what was going on, he did some studying after the war. But that's how he described it. So they're carrying these really massively heavy 9-inch boxes. They put them down. The Japanese officers, Tomonaga and Shoji, are painting U-235 on the boxes. So they're actually labeling the boxes the correct isotope for enriched uranium, and then they're stowing them in the tubes that are described in the document that I told you about. And actually, I had that a second ago. I was going to just read that the header of that document, or the interesting part of that document too, but apparently I've lost it. Anyway, so you've got that. There's another interesting. So they stowed them in the mine shaft. Then there's another document that I found. It's a transcript of a recording of a transmission that was received, and it says this is U.S. Navy secret transmission 292045 from Commander Naval Operations, once again to Portsmouth Naval Yard. This is on the 30th of May. Now, U-234 was brought into Portsmouth on the 19th of May, so it's been somewhere in the neighborhood of coming up between 10 days, 2 weeks or something that they've had U-234 when this comes out. It says, Lieutenant Commander Carl B. Reese, USNR, Lieutenant J.G. Edward P. McDermott, USNR, and Major John E. Vance, CE, USA, will report to Commandant May 30th, Wednesday, in connection with cargo of U-234. Now, the naval aspect in that is to be expected because it's a Navy operation, but CE, USA is the Corps of Engineers for the U.S. Army. All of a sudden, somehow, you got a U.S. Army guy in sorting out the unloading and disposition of U-234, which any of you who've been in the military know that they're pretty jealous about what they capture and what they got and sharing it. So, somebody up above had to tell them, hey, you guys need to play nice and share with Major Vance. Well, there's another document I found after they start unloading, and this is a transcript of a telephone call between two of this that read right now comes from the archives of the Manhattan Project, specifically their intelligence group, which was called Alsos, which is the Greek name for Groves, so they named it after General Groves. But anyway, oh, you didn't know that? Yeah,
I didn't.
I thought that was fun. Anyway, it says this is telephone. I'm going to read telephone transcript between Manhattan Project Security Officers Major Smith and Major Trainer. This is on the 14th of June, so we're another 2 weeks after Major Vance has started unloading U-234. It says, I just got a shipment in of captured material. I have just talked to Vance and they are taking it off the ship. I have about 80 cases of U-Power and he, Vance, is handling all of that now. So we have a Corps of Engineers Army officer involved in unloading U-234. We have a Manhattan Project intelligence officer, but unloading U-234 and communicating what he's doing with the Manhattan Project, and they both happen to have this last name of Vance. So it's I think it's highly probable we're talking about the same Vance. By the way, the document that I got, that later one that was out of the Manhattan Project, it goes on to describe. This was a document I stated earlier. It goes on to describe that the uranium was actually separated into 80 cylinders, and when you divide 580 kilograms by 80, you end up with slightly under half of critical mass. So that, I think, is a telling indicator that way. There's no need to. You're on a submarine. You got all this stuff you're trying to transport. Every inch of cubic space is valuable, and yet they're dividing this stuff into 15 pounds or 15 kilograms each, and putting them in cylinders. That's not an efficient way to transport anything. Uranium, natural uranium, nothing would have happened with natural uranium if they'd have packed them just in big cases, right?
Right.
But they go to a lot of trouble to pack it this way. I found this other piece of this document the very first one I referenced. It says, as long as cylinders not open can be handled like crude TNT. These containers should not be opened. The substance will become sensitive and dangerous. Now, I've talked to no fewer, and it's in the book. I mean, Ray will tell you. It sounds like he's gotten down on it. But I've talked to no fewer than 6 world-class experts on uranium, enriched uranium. Some of them actual physicists, nuclear physicists. Some of them nuclear engineers, and they all, to a man, say that was enriched uranium. There's no way they would have stowed. I got to qualify this. I qualified this in the podcast because it's a fun little story. But there was one, and his name was, I remembered his name, Ray. I couldn't remember it last time. His name was Carl Sandquist. He was an instructor at West Point of nuclear engineering. And I got all these other blurbs, quotes saying, this was enriched uranium. And his quote, he said something like, it is, hold on, I'll read this quote here. He says, the assertion in Critical Mass that the uranium surrendered to U.S. authorities on board the German submarine U-234 was enriched U-235 is certainly a credible conclusion in view of the storage, containment, and prevailing shipping conditions. And when he said that, I'd already had most of the other quotes that I had, and I said, hold on a second. All the other guys I've talked to have said this is for sure enriched uranium. Why don't you say that? And he said, well, the only reason I say that is because they could actually have put raw uranium in those gold line tubes. He said, but you could spend a lot of money, build a really fancy wine cellar, controlling the temperature and the humidity and making sure you use the right wood to store everything in, and store Kool-Aid in it, but would you? So that was his response to why he couldn't give me a clear and concise, it wasn't absolutely enriched uranium. Okay. But basically he was saying anybody who didn't put rich uranium in that setup was crazy. So, right. Yeah. So there's all kinds of evidence. It's labeled enriched uranium. It's described, the stowage is rich uranium. enriched uranium. The cylinders, as you probably know, I'm talking to a pretty well educated, I think, audience here. But cylinders are the right to geometry to store enriched uranium in, because you don't want to have tight, sides coming together. You make a hypercritical mass, not a subcritical mass, and then you got problems, right? They describe it as handling it like TNT. How do they handle TNT? They keep it in smaller quantities so they can keep it separate, because if they have something go, they don't have a catastrophic event. Now TNT won't self-detonate like enriched uranium will if you put it together. It won't detonate, but it will start a chain reaction like enriched uranium will. So it's even more important to keep them separated, isolated. But every scientist I've talked to has said that is enriched uranium, and that's, to me, that is the crucial element to start this whole thing. The science says it's enriched uranium. The documentation makes it clear it came from Germany. So the Germans did enrich uranium for a bomb, and they enriched 1,160 kilograms or 560 kilograms, 1,120 pounds of enriched uranium, which is a fair amount of enriched uranium, right? Dr. Delmar Bergen, who was the director of the nuclear weapons program at Los Alamos for several years, he actually wrote the foreword to the third edition of the book, and he has basically said, there's no doubt it was enriched uranium. His personal opinion, he wrote it in the foreword, is that there was enough to make at least one atomic bomb. Now, 1,160, I'm going to stay with kilograms, 560 kilograms is enough to make about 10 bombs if it's bomb grade enriched. But we don't have any idea what the enrichment was on it. I've taken the position in the book, just in terms of being conservative about the whole thing, that it was low grade enriched uranium. But even at that, if you take that use it as alpha stock in the beta, which is I think what happened, and we can talk about that later. But then it's enough to make at least one bomb. But if it had been enriched as it was when it came on the U-boat, there was enough for 10 bombs there, perhaps 11. So to me, that's the important essence. It was enriched uranium, and the Germans had a bomb.
Okay.
Do you want to keep going on there, or do you want to?
No, wait just a minute. So we've convinced ourselves that there was some level of enriched uranium, and we know the amount, 560 kilograms, and we don't know the actual enrichment, but we do know that it was labeled U-235. Now, we know that the captain of the U-boat decided to surrender to the United States, and I might add, and you can amplify on this if you like, but those two Japanese officers did not come the rest of the way with the boat. What happened to them?
They didn't make it to the end. They started, but they didn't make it to the end. They when they realized. So let's back up just a little bit, because the captain, Ray already said, the captain decided to surrender to the U.S. The captain was not in the U.S. territory of surrender when he got to orders to surrender.
Right.
He was still in British area of surrender, and you need to read about it in the book. It's very detailed, but it becomes clear. I track it in the book and show it on C charts of where he was and what he was doing and what he was reporting. And it's very clear that he was being very deceivious about where he was going to surrender, and that he was very intent on surrendering to the United States. The Germans, the Japanese, the two Japanese officers were on the boat. When they found out that he was surrendering and they couldn't talk him out of surrendering, they both committed, I want to say harikari, but it wasn't, you got to do
it was suicide.
The dagger thing, harikari, and they took away all our weapons, so they couldn't do that. But they killed themselves with the overdoses of luminol. Now, it's interesting that Failer, he says in his in different places. He gives different stories about what's going on. When they asked him about the Japanese, he said, well, he told them he would take them back to the Canary Islands or back to Portugal, but they killed themselves before he could do that. That is a bunch of malarkey, because he was way past that point. He had already indicated his intent to surrender. You don't indicate your intent to surrender and then start, and he was already well west of the Canaries and Portugal, southwest. Yeah. You don't indicate your intent to surrender and then start sailing all over the Atlantic with, allies trying to find you. He just kept going as fast as he could, and it shows. His chart shows what's called the Great Circle, that he was tracking on the Great Circle, which would have been how he would normally be going to Japan. But when you look at the coordinates that he gives in his logbook, he goes a completely different way than the Great Circle. And when you look at the direction finder, every time the U.S. intercepted signals from them on the direction finder transmissions, and you can see when you get the book, you can actually see where they give coordinates for the U-boat, and then in the bottom it says D/F, and then it gives the actual coordinates. Well, not in every case, but in the last two cases, Failer, the captain of the U-boats, gives false coordinates. He gives coordinates, and the direction finder says he's not there, he's there. So when you look at all that, and I put it together, and you look at it on the chart, you can see that he's not following the Great Circle at all to Japan. He's actually coming, and I cover this more in the book as well, where I show that he actually turned around, went back up over through the Faroe Islands, straight down to Hamburg, picked something up, and came out the English Channel. And he was protected by the U.S. as he did it. The U.S. prevented at least 4 attacks on the U-boat from happening when the U-boat was in sight and easily bombable, and they didn't let him touch him. And he came out, the U-boat, you can see and you track it in the map, you can see he's shooting straight down from the English Channel, heading straight for the U.S. So he's actually coming a little south of the English Channel, but that's because he went into the Bay of Biscay, because there's great evidence. I mentioned earlier at the top of the class. I'm used to doing podcasts and interview shows, and this is a class, so I have to change my. Anyway, okay. There is significant proof that Martin Bormann, who is the secretary of the Nazi Party, was on U-234, and he was dropped off in the Bay of Biscay to a connection there and taken to Spain. And then, so the track is actually just slightly south of the English Channel, and it's just zipping straight over to the U.S. He gets to a point where when they find out he's being deceitful, even after he reports in these things, that's another thing. The Failer reports in his transmissions that he's going, I think the bearing is 180, 108, no, it's 210. Anyway, his bearings indicate he's going basically west-southwest toward the U.S. at a speed of 8 knots. He is going for the last 2.5, 3 days. He's going roughly that same direction, but he's about 100 miles south of that, and he's going full speed. He's going 16.5 knots, which is maxed out for that U-boat. He's going as fast as he can, and he's trying to get to the place where he actually reports where he is, where he's supposed to surrender. But he's not there. He reports he surrenders. When he reports he's in this certain place and he wants to surrender, he's not actually there. He's way east of it. When he actually gets to where they find him, he's way west of it, but he reports the same thing. And it's very confusing. You need to kind of read it. But he's obviously, once again, Wolfgang Hirschfeld, his radio operator, his account defies Hirschfeld's and says they did different things, and Hirschfeld's account is accurate almost to a T on where they were and what they were doing, and it's just clear that they were determined to surrender to the United States, even though they were in English waters when they first announced they wanted to surrender, even though they were in Canadian waters when they were first spotted. A Canadian plane spotted them, said, "Hey, you need to go to Halifax," and then shortly after that, the United States destroyer USS Stetson starts blocking all communication, and tells U-234 that they'll communicate by signals, and they communicate by light signals by not semaphore but Morse code until they surrender to the U.S. Sutton in Canadian waters. Okay.
Okay.
So there was a determination that's a small part of what makes me convinced that the materials were part of a deal with the United States from Germany to turn those bomb makings over to the U.S.
So now we have the submarine in U.S. custody. We have it brought in. Now pick up what happened to the U-235 after it came after they came ashore.
Well, as I said, so from the documentation, it came in. Major Vance took control of it, sent it to. That's what I was looking for. Indian Head, Maryland. So it's Maryland. It went to Indian Head, Maryland, where the Bureau of Ordnance for the Navy is, and their research facilities are in that area. And then it went into the Manhattan Project. You can see there's the traditional history, and we covered this in the podcast. The traditional history has has the uranium. They knew the traditional history says that the Manhattan Project, Oak Ridge specifically, was short on enough uranium. You were successful, and I want to make it clear. I was trying to make it clear. I believe, I know the Manhattan Project was successful in everything it said it did, with the exception of creating a detonator that'll simultaneously fire off the plutonium bomb. We'll talk about that in a minute. You guys enriched uranium, you guys, created plutonium, all that kind of stuff happened as the designed in the history. The problem was that they didn't have a way to fire off, to trigger the plutonium, and they didn't have enough uranium, and wouldn't have enough uranium before, by my calculations, November 28th, 1945, which meant by the time you metallicize it, fabricate the USS Indianapolis, get it over to Tinian, you're talking about the beginning of 1946 before we actually would have had a bomb for Japan. And the problem with that is by then Stalin would have taken over Japan and all of its holdings, and we'd have had a whole different scenario for the world than we lived at the time. But going back, so the uranium was tracked into the Manhattan Project, to Oak Ridge specifically. Now, Groves, in his book Now Can Be Told, said that, we were massively short of uranium, but at such and such a date, the liquid diffusion that the Navy was working on came into process, and we were able to use that as alpha stocks. And then later gaseous diffusion came on, and we were able to use that as alpha stocks. And that is what saved us and got us enough uranium to use for the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. I mentioned I went to the Southeast Archives, which are where Oak Ridge's archives are, that aren't kept on site. If you still have classified stuff, it's still on site, but stuff that's gone and has been given permission to be declassified has gone to East Point. So I went there twice and went through 38. I had them pull 38 boxes. I only got through 6 boxes. There's still a bunch of them that still haven't had their declassification seals broken. But in one of those boxes, I found a series of documents, and one of them was the daily beta output production record of Oak Ridge. And so I charted that, and it's in the book. We looked at it in the podcast. I charted that, and you can see the actual line by the end of December of 1944. all the beta, all the alpha and all the beta calutrons were in full functioning, and they were describing a straight line with very few, one or two minor deviations. And nothing was added to them before the end of the war. When you look at that graph, there's two lines I put in there. One is where the liquid diffusion was supposed to come and play, and one was where gaseous diffusion was coming to play. There is no uptick in either one of those from either one of those supposed inputs. The only uptick comes about 2 weeks after the Manhattan Project takes over the enriched uranium from U-234. Then you see this uptick. It's a hockey stick, and it goes up. So that's, you know, it's circumstantial evidence. As you read the book, you'll see it's very significant. It's just not one or two things, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that says that that's what happened. And then that was what was used to make the Hiroshima bomb. The plutonium bomb, as I said, was a different problem. And this is all historically known as part of the historical record, that not only were we short on uranium, but we could not get the triggers for the plutonium bombs operational. Norris Bradbury, who later, as you guys probably know, was the director of Oak Ridge, was actually the person responsible for the testing of the triggers for the plutonium bomb. And he put out a memo, it's in the book, I can't remember the exact date, but within weeks before the Trinity test, where he said, we've tested hundreds of these detonators, and I mentioned a guy by the name of Heinz Schlicke.
Carter, we're having difficulty. We're losing you. I don't know why.
Okay.
Just go ahead and say that last sentence or two over again.
Okay. I'm trying to remember where I was. The Manhattan Project had Heinz Schlicke. He was responsible. He had a bunch of infrared proximity fuses with him on U-234.
Yeah.
He was, there's all kinds of evidence that he was handled his, he described, both he and Failer handled or described his handler when he was surrendered with the Navy intelligence as an officer by the name of Commander or Lieutenant Commander Alvarez. And this, Luis Alvarez is the person famous in the history of the Manhattan Project for resolving the simultaneity issue of the triggers for the plutonium bomb. Well, Alvarez had said, let me back up. Anyway, we're running out of time, I realize. Alvarez was all over this. I mentioned that they both Failer and Schlicke said that Alvarez was their handler. Schlicke said that he was interesting because he was always very polite, but also very primitive at interrogating, which doesn't make sense. It's kind of weird until you realize that it was Luis Alvarez. Now, they both identify him as an officer and as a commander in the Navy. Did I say colonel again? Lieutenant commander, or a commander, full commander, and lieutenant commander. They both described him that way. I got both the rosters for the Navy for 1943 and 1945, and there is not an officer of any rank in either roster for either time in any of the U.S. Navy. So that is, and Gross was very open and frank in his book, as well as in other articles and interviews, that he sometimes gave his scientists ranks and uniforms and all kinds of stuff so they could work better with the military, because that was the priority. He's very open about it after the fact, but at that time, it's very clear to me. And it talks about, there's actually a document when Schlicke, this is actually after the war, but when Schlicke is with Alvarez and he's giving a lecture, and they tell him, you know, Schlicke is going to be talking, but when we're done and you have questions, present them to Alvarez, Officer Alvarez, and he'll handle them from there. it's, so the long and short is while the Manhattan Project was very close to being successful, they wouldn't have been successful in time to end the war before USSR took over Japan, and there would have been no nuclear deterrent by the time Russia took over Japan and the Asia Pacific Rim, which is, I mean, you got a huge population, a massive amount of resources. You got Singapore, Hong Kong. You have very very strategically located and important cities. All of that would have gone to the Soviet Union. They, in my opinion, under those circumstances, would have been the single reigning superpower in the world. And I don't know what we could have done about it other than once we did solve the problems with our atomic bombs, just take it out, duke it out with them. I don't think anybody would have wanted that to happen. That is why this is important history. That's why U-234 is important. Everything else about the Manhattan Project is true, and it wouldn't, what we just described wouldn't have happened without it. But it also wouldn't have happened if U-234 hadn't come with these last few pieces needed to get the bombs completed in time to strategically for an strategic imperative for the United States to have the position it had at the end of the war. That wouldn't have been the case at the end of the war if this hadn't happened.
I think you've made a really good point there about the significance and the importance of this particular submarine and the material that it handled. One other point that you made to me before is that you actually documented Oppenheimer's presence in the area where the submarine was. You remember?
There are photos of a person who I absolutely strongly am convinced is Oppenheimer. They're not clear enough that you can see his face. He's outside, and he's in the front and the nose of the boat, and they're taken from the conning tower of U-234. So I don't know what that distance is, 30 or 40 yards maybe.
Yeah.
And there's shadow, but everybody, if you've seen Oppenheimer, you know what kind of clothes he wears. You know he wears this little crumpled hat.
Yeah.
He's tall and skinny and wearing those clothes and that crumpled hat. So and there are people who strongly believe, and I am one of them, that was Oppenheimer. I did not put it in the book. I tried to keep a conservative stance and only put in what I had enough to really be convincing. And to me, I would err on the side of, if it's not truly convincing and people question it, they're going to question everything else. So I'm not putting it in there. So that's the approach, the philosophy I took on how I put it together and wrote it. But I'm absolutely convinced. And there's another gentleman there that looks like it could be Alvarez, but he was a more average size and average stature person. But Oppenheimer's silhouette is hard to miss, especially with that hat on, right?
I agree. I understand. Well, listen, thank you very much for the details that you've gone into. We have a few minutes left, and I would really be delighted if any of you in the class would want to ask Carter any questions about what he's presented. So let's give you a little bit of time here. Just unmute yourself and start talking. And let's ask Carter any questions you want about the submarine, about the material or his research or his book. So go ahead and ask your question. Just unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hi, I'm curious. If I understood correctly, there was an incredible amount of material in that U-boat. I mean, a Messerschmitt and another aircraft and this and that. I find it sort of incredulous that all that stuff could be crammed into a submarine, and what happened to all that other stuff?
So, and that's a really good question. I will tell you, it's historically documented. Even the traditional history says that it was all in this submarine. That's not stuff that I came up with on my own. The thing about U-234 is it was one of 10 refueling boats. And so it was 3 times the size of the average U-boat, okay? and that's even if you go with it. There's a Type 7, which is a little smaller than the Type 9, which was probably 20-30% bigger, and then the Type 10, which is what 10B, which is what U-234 was, and it was, like I said, 200% bigger than the average U-boats. And so they filled it, they jam-packed it. But then not only that, they had so much stuff they wanted to take that they put it in dry dock. They took the outer, it's got a dual hull. They took the outer hull off and stowed a bunch of stuff in between the hulls and welded them back in there. So when you read the account at Portsmouth, you read how they're up there cutting off the sheets of steel so they could mostly it was mercury in their liquid mercury, and they were taking that out there. There's also a lot of glass and stuff, and primarily that was, I think, the mercury. So mercury is a really good conductor, and I believe that was part of the infrared proximity fuses. It's fast, you know. They needed that electrical speed. So, but yeah, it's all that stuff was in there. It's how they did it was remarkable. And another interesting thing, they sailed it up to from Kiel. They sailed it up to Christiansand. Not even Christiansand. There's one other place where it ran through its trials, and it actually got hit by another U-boat that was practicing running submerged, and it hit U-234 kind of in the side toward the nose of all places. The U-234 wasn't in, 235 wasn't in there at the time. But they had this hole in the bow of the U-boat, and it was loaded with everything but the uranium, which they had taken off for safety. So they had this massively heavy, huge U-boat, and they were trying to figure out how do you weld this? If we lift it up, it's going to break in half. What they did was they flooded the back of the boat and just put it so that the nose was sticking up, and they were able to weld how they did it. They were very resourceful in how they fixed that. Just a fun little sidelight, but it was interesting that happened for one thing, and that they were able to fix it that way, because they were, for a few days, they were like, how in the world are we going to do this? And somebody, probably one of the crewmen, said, why don't you just stick the back end and it'll stick up the nose. Anyway. Who else? What else? Or did you have more?
Yeah. Let's give them another chance. Thank you, Jim, for that question.
If it matters to you, I'm here till the cows come home. Well, I'm here till at least 1 o'clock. So I know you have a time frame, but I'll stay as long as you want.
Now, we don't have that much time. We have to stop in a few minutes. But if there are other questions, please ask him.
Absolutely.
Well, I would also be curious if you have a theory as to what or evidence as to how Germany, what process they used for enrichment.
Yeah, they used, this is really pretty fascinating too. They used a process very similar to our calutrons. It was developed by a count, a baron by the name of Manfred von Ardena. He was wealthy, but he was very young. He was in his 20s. He had actually designed. Everybody knows if you're a historian about World War II at all, or Hitler at all, everybody knows that in the 1936 Olympics, the first television that was actually used and broadcast was of Hitler opening the Berlin Games in 1936, right? Mm-hmm. That television was created, invented, designed, and operated by Ardena himself. He was a genius. He didn't have any nuclear engineering schooling or physicist schooling, but he loved it, and he had the money, and he could hire the people to teach him. And he was fascinated with this, and he created his own basically calutrons, but he was 2 years ahead of the US, and it was 4 times more efficient than the source, the part that ionized the you know what ionization is. It ionized the U-235 or the uranium to get U-235 was 4 times more efficient than our own calutron sources. It was a very efficient process. He had it done in about late 1942 or early 1943. And then it kind of goes dark, and you don't hear anything about him again until he's captured by the Soviets. That's the traditional history. What I've been able to find out is, and there's all kinds of circumstantial evidence for this too. The book will tell you all about it, obviously, but there was a plant. It's thought to be declared to have been a Buna plant, a synthetic rubber plant at Monowitz in Auschwitz that IG Farben operated. That plant had none of the characteristics of a Buna plant, except that it used some the Buna plant will use some electricity, but not very much. The plant, according to, after at Munich, not Munich, at the trials, Nuremberg trials, the directors of IG Farben said that the plant, they worked on the plant for 4 years. It consumed more energy, more electricity than the city of Berlin, which was the 8th largest city in the world at the time. And it never produced an ounce of Buna. Okay, never produced an ounce of rubber. That it took 4 years. Now, IG Farben created the Buna process and had been using it since 1921, I think it was, or 26. So they should have been really good at making Buna plants. The one of them blew up and they rebuilt it in 6 months before the war. So they should have been really good. So, so Delmar Bergen, the director I told you about, that was the director of the nuclear weapons program at Los Alamos, by virtue of his work there, he was involved and understood what enriched uranium is and how to do it and all that kind of stuff. And he's like, there's no way that was a Buna plant. This is in the forward too. There's no way that was a Buna plant. That was enriched uranium. And he said, my daddy taught me. We lived in Nebraska. My dad taught me that if a snake has diamonds on its back like a rattlesnake and it has a rattle and it makes a rattling noise, it's probably a rattlesnake, so you should pay attention to it. He said that Buna plant was a uranium enrichment plant, and he just flat out said that's what it is. So the traditional, I'm sorry?
No, go ahead and finish.
Okay, the traditional history says that the Germans failed to create an atomic bomb because their plutonium bomb failed. They couldn't create plutonium, and that's a whole different story, and you probably already know that. There's nothing in the traditional history that says the Germans actually enriched uranium, but they did, and I prove it in the book. And Groves uses the plutonium failure to kind of hide, to shield the fact that Germany had a uranium plant and that they were successful enriching uranium, and that's how we got it.
So thank you very much. I have another question that came in on the chat, and let's answer it quickly because we're out of time. The question is, why did the captain want to surrender to the United States rather than Russia or other Allied forces?
So this is all in the book. So as quickly as I can, read the book. The short answer is Martin Bormann, who I mentioned before, was the secretary of the Nazi Party. In other words, he was the leader of the Nazi Party, and he was also Adolf Hitler's right-hand man. Bormann made a deal with the United States, with Allen Dulles Bormann made a deal through General Karl Wolff, who was the plenipotentiary in Italy at the time, but previously had been over IG Farben and over the building of the quote-unquote Buna plant. Bormann had him reassigned plenipotentiary for Italy, and he is the person famous for working with Dulles in what's called Operation Sunrise to surrender Germany's southern front in Italy. Okay, and it was supposed to be an unconditional surrender. According to traditional history, it was an unconditional surrender, but you can see it in the book. There's all kinds of evidence that there was a deal going on underneath that unconditional surrender, and that deal was for this uranium as a ransom. We would get the uranium if we would allow Martin Bormann to escape, and he had basically, and there's all kind of, this is all in the book too. The whole last half of the book is about this part of it. He had taken the German economy as much as he could get. He put it in a ghost economy. in neutral and allies of German countries. And the deal was the U.S. would protect him, allow him to escape and protect him after the war for the uranium and the infrared fuses, in order to allow Martin Bormann to escape in the Bay of Biscay, stay in Europe until he had his European financial situation all finished up, and then protect him for the rest of his life, which they did. Bormann's vision was that, and there's a couple of good books about this, but Bormann's vision was that Germany had tried twice militarily to control Europe, and it was now going to control it economically through a European economic community, which is exactly what happened, and is what we are living in.
Okay, thank you. We are completely out of time. And folks, I really do appreciate you hanging in there with us. And Carter, thank you so much for being.
Thanks again for the invite.
Yeah,
so it's always good to see you, Ray. We always have a good chat. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Get the book, get the history out there. It's the right history, and it needs to be out there. Thank you.
You bet. Okay, guys. See you next Monday.